Some doors only open once, and if someone is standing on the other side, your life may never be the same again. Mason Walker never planned to stay at Lincoln Ridge Performing Arts Center after the final applause faded into silence. At 23 years old, music had become both his greatest comfort and his heaviest burden. Every performance earned praise from strangers who believed confidence came naturally to him, yet none of them ever saw the exhausting effort required to smile beneath the stage lights. That Friday evening, the annual community concert had filled every seat inside the historic auditorium. Families lingered in the lobby, congratulating young musicians, while volunteers folded programs and stacked empty chairs. Mason accepted compliments with polite gratitude before quietly slipping away through a side hallway that led toward the old rehearsal wing. The farther he walked, the quieter the building became until only the distant hum of the ventilation system remained. He unlocked a small practice room where a weathered grand piano waited beneath soft ceiling lights. Closing the door behind him, he rested both hands against the polished instrument and finally allowed himself to breathe. The silence felt heavier than the music had. For months he had carried questions he never dared speak aloud, afraid that honesty might cost him friendships, opportunities, or the carefully balanced life he had spent years building. Every expectation from family, teachers, and even himself seemed to press against his shoulders at once. He lowered himself onto the piano bench and stared at the worn ivory keys without playing a single note. His reflection shimmered faintly across the glossy black surface of the instrument. For the first time all evening, the carefully practiced smile disappeared. He closed his eyes as emotion quietly surfaced, not because of one terrible event, but because of countless small moments that had slowly become impossible to ignore. Outside the rehearsal room, another pair of footsteps echoed through the empty hallway. Ryan Carter had volunteered to help the event staff return borrowed music stands before heading home. At 24, Ryan was known throughout the center for his easygoing personality, patient encouragement, and habit of staying late whenever someone needed an extra hand. He carried a stack of sheet music beneath one arm, while checking each rehearsal room to make sure the lights had been turned off. When he reached the final door, he noticed a faint glow beneath it. Assuming someone had forgotten to leave, he knocked gently. Receiving no answer, he carefully pushed the door open just a few inches. The quiet room came into view. Mason sat alone at the piano, shoulders slightly lowered, unaware anyone had entered. Ryan immediately understood he had walked into a private moment never meant for an audience. He did not step farther inside. He did not ask questions. He simply froze, surprised by the vulnerability of someone who always appeared so composed in public. A floorboard creaked softly beneath Ryan's shoe. Mason looked up instantly. Their eyes met across the room. Time seemed to pause between them. Embarrassment rushed across Mason's face before he quickly stood, brushing away the emotion he believed had become visible. Without saying a word, he grabbed his backpack, hurried past Ryan, and disappeared into the hallway before Ryan could even apologize for opening the door. The practice room fell silent once again. Ryan remained standing in the doorway, staring at the empty piano bench where a single page of handwritten sheet music had been left behind. He carefully picked it up, noticing unfinished melodies and a sentence written neatly across the top margin. It read, "One day I hope I stop pretending." Ryan folded the page with quiet respect, placed it safely inside the music folder he was carrying, and softly closed the rehearsal room door, already knowing that the next time he saw Mason, the most important thing he could offer would not be advice, but kindness. The following morning, Mason arrived at the Performing Arts Center earlier than usual, hoping the quiet building would help him forget what had happened the night before. Sunlight filtered through the tall lobby windows, painting long golden lines across the polished floor while volunteers prepared rehearsal schedules for the coming week. Everything looked exactly the same, yet Mason felt as though every familiar hallway had become unfamiliar overnight. He convinced himself Ryan would avoid him after witnessing such a private moment. The thought alone made him consider turning around and leaving before anyone noticed he had arrived. Instead, he tightened the strap of his backpack and walked toward the rehearsal wing, determined to behave as though nothing had happened. Ryan spotted Mason from across the lobby, but did not immediately approach him. He remembered the expression on Mason's face when the practice room door had opened and understood that forcing a conversation would only make things worse. Rather than asking questions or mentioning the previous evening, Ryan quietly stopped by the cafe inside the center and ordered 2 cups of coffee. One was for himself. The other he left outside the rehearsal room where Mason usually practiced. Beside the warm paper cup rested a neatly folded note containing only 3 handwritten words. "Take your time." There was no signature because none was necessary. A few minutes later, Mason opened the rehearsal room door and froze. He looked down at the coffee, then unfolded the note with cautious hands. He read the message once, then again, almost expecting hidden meaning between the simple words. There was none. No curiosity, no judgment, no request for explanations. Only unexpected kindness. Mason slowly picked up the coffee and glanced down the empty hallway. Ryan was nowhere to be seen. Throughout the morning, they crossed paths several times while musicians prepared for upcoming workshops. Each time Ryan greeted Mason with the same relaxed smile he offered everyone else. They spoke about rehearsal schedules, instrument storage, and volunteer assignments exactly as they always had. Ryan never mentioned the practice room. He never looked at Mason with sympathy or discomfort. His quiet respect gradually became more powerful than any reassuring speech could have been. By lunchtime, Mason found himself watching Ryan from across the courtyard where students and instructors gathered beneath large maple trees. Ryan laughed with a group of young performers while helping them carry equipment into the auditorium, treating every person with the same patience and encouragement. Mason realized that kindness was not something Ryan performed for special situations. It was simply who he was. Later that afternoon, Mason entered the empty recital hall to practice alone. As he placed the coffee cup on top of the grand piano, a folded sheet of paper slipped from inside his music folder. Confused, he unfolded it and immediately recognized the unfinished melody he had left behind the previous evening. The page had been carefully preserved without a single crease. Across the bottom, written in neat handwriting different from his own, appeared one short sentence. "Your music deserves to be heard whenever you are ready." Mason traced the words gently with his fingertips. His first instinct was still to hide, to protect himself before someone else could disappoint him. Yet for the first time in a very long while, another feeling quietly began to grow beside that fear. It was hope, small enough to fit inside a single handwritten sentence, but strong enough to make him believe that perhaps being truly seen did not always end in rejection. Somewhere else inside the building, Ryan continued his afternoon without expecting anything in return, completely unaware that his quiet act of understanding had already begun changing the story Mason believed he had to live. Mason read Ryan's handwritten sentence so many times that the paper began to soften around the edges. It was remarkable how 12 simple words could quiet fears that had followed him for years. No one had asked him to explain himself. No one had offered unwanted advice. Ryan had simply left room for Mason to decide when he was ready. The thought stayed with him throughout the following week as rehearsals filled every afternoon inside the Performing Arts Center. Their schedules crossed naturally, sometimes in the hallway outside the recital hall, sometimes near the cafe, sometimes while helping younger students prepare for workshops. Every encounter remained ordinary. Ryan smiled, asked whether rehearsal was going well, carried heavy equipment when someone needed help, and continued treating Mason exactly as he treated everyone else. That normality slowly became the greatest gift Mason had ever received. He no longer dreaded seeing Ryan. Instead, he found himself quietly searching crowded rooms until he spotted the familiar, easygoing smile. One rainy afternoon, the center lost power for several minutes while a storm passed through the neighborhood. Rehearsals paused as musicians gathered in the lobby waiting for the lights to return. Ryan noticed Mason sitting alone near the large front windows, absent-mindedly tapping silent melodies against his coffee cup. Rather than interrupting the quiet, Ryan walked over and sat in the empty chair beside him. For nearly a minute, neither of them spoke. They simply watched raindrops race down the glass while thunder rolled somewhere beyond the city skyline. Finally, Ryan smiled. "Looks like the weather scheduled its own performance today." Mason laughed before he could stop himself. The sound surprised them both. It felt unfamiliar, lighter than anything he had experienced in weeks. "It definitely has better timing than most musicians," Mason replied. Ryan grinned. "Do not let the percussion section hear you say that." The conversation drifted effortlessly from music to favorite composers, from childhood piano lessons to embarrassing audition stories. Mason learned Ryan had once dreamed of becoming a music teacher before choosing arts administration because he loved helping performers succeed behind the scenes. Ryan discovered Mason collected old vinyl records from neighborhood thrift stores simply because he enjoyed imagining the families who had once listened to them together. Every answer revealed another ordinary detail, yet those ordinary details slowly built something extraordinary. When the lights finally returned, neither of them seemed eager to end the conversation. Over the next several days, they began sharing lunch between rehearsals, walking through the nearby public park after evening practice, and stopping at the same neighborhood bakery where the owner always insisted they sample fresh cookies before leaving. Mason noticed something unexpected happening inside himself. He no longer measured every sentence before speaking. Around Ryan, silence never felt uncomfortable. It felt safe. One evening they paused on a pedestrian bridge overlooking the river as the setting sun painted the water in shades of gold and orange. Ryan rested his arms lightly against the railing and watched ducks glide across the calm current. Without looking away, he asked softly, "Can I tell you something?" Mason nodded. Ryan smiled gently. "The strongest people I have ever met are never the ones who pretend everything is perfect. They are the ones who keep showing up even on the days they feel uncertain." Mason looked toward the glowing reflection beneath the bridge. Those words settled somewhere deep inside him because they described the person he wanted to become rather than the person he believed everyone expected him to be. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the future no longer felt like something to fear. It felt like a melody waiting patiently for the right moment to finally be played. Mason could no longer remember the last time he had looked forward to an ordinary afternoon, yet somehow the simplest moments had become the ones he treasured most. The Performing Arts Center slowly settled into its familiar rhythm as autumn gave way to early winter. Rehearsals filled the halls with piano scales, violin passages, and laughter echoing from classrooms where young musicians chased impossible perfection one note at a time. Mason still practiced every evening, but something inside him had quietly changed. The empty rehearsal room no longer felt like a place to hide. It had become a place where he could simply be himself. One afternoon, Ryan found Mason sitting alone at the grand piano, gently improvising a melody that seemed to drift through the room like sunlight. Ryan leaned against the doorway without interrupting, waiting until the final note faded into silence. Mason looked up and smiled naturally instead of shrinking away. "You can come in," he said. Ryan stepped inside with a paper bag from the neighborhood bakery resting beneath one arm. "I brought cinnamon rolls," he said with a grin. "I figured good music deserved good food." Mason laughed softly and motioned toward the piano bench. They shared the warm pastries while talking about everything except the things that had once seemed impossible to discuss. Ryan described funny stories from organizing children's music workshops. Mason admitted he had secretly written dozens of unfinished songs over the years, but had never allowed anyone to hear them. Ryan listened with genuine interest instead of surprise. "Maybe unfinished songs are not failures," Ryan said quietly. "Maybe they are just waiting for the right ending." Those words lingered long after the conversation moved on. As evening approached, they left the building together and wandered through the nearby park where decorative lights had begun appearing in preparation for the holiday season. Families strolled along the pathways while children pointed excitedly at colorful displays hanging from the trees. Mason watched a father patiently helping his young daughter adjust a tiny scarf before they continued walking together. The simple moment made him unexpectedly emotional. Ryan noticed the thoughtful expression crossing Mason's face, but did not ask why. They continued in comfortable silence until Mason finally spoke. "I have spent so much of my life trying to become the version of myself that everyone else expected." Ryan turned toward him without saying a word. Mason drew a slow breath before continuing. "After a while, I forgot what my own voice sounded like." Ryan rested his hands inside the pockets of his jacket and nodded gently. "You do not have to find it all at once." Mason looked at him with quiet curiosity. Ryan smiled with the same calm kindness that had slowly become familiar. Some of the best musicians spend years discovering the sound that truly belongs to them. People are not any different. They reached a small bridge overlooking the river where thousands of tiny reflections shimmered across the water beneath the city lights. Mason leaned against the railing, feeling the cold evening air brush across his face. For the first time, he found himself speaking openly about the fear that had followed him for years, about the exhausting habit of pretending everything was fine even when it was not, about wondering whether anyone would still accept him if they truly understood who he was. Ryan never interrupted. He never searched for perfect answers. He simply remained beside Mason, listening with complete attention until every difficult word had finally been spoken. When the silence returned, it no longer felt heavy. It felt peaceful. Mason realized that trust had not appeared through one dramatic moment. It had been built through dozens of quiet choices, each one teaching him that being understood began with finding someone willing to listen before asking anything in return. Winter settled gently over the city, covering sidewalks with a light dusting of snow that reflected the glow of holiday lights hanging across downtown streets. Inside the Performing Arts Center, preparations had already begun for the annual Winter Showcase, the busiest event of the season. Students hurried between rehearsal rooms carrying instrument cases, while volunteers adjusted decorations and tested stage lighting late into every evening. Mason found himself spending more time inside the building than anywhere else, not because he felt obligated, but because it had slowly become the one place where he no longer felt the need to hide behind carefully practiced smiles. Ryan seemed to appear wherever encouragement was needed, helping nervous performers calm their fears before rehearsals, organizing schedules with effortless patience, and somehow remembering every student's name despite the endless activity surrounding him. One evening, Mason arrived early and found Ryan standing alone in the empty auditorium, quietly replacing burned-out bulbs along the edge of the stage before anyone else arrived. Without saying anything, Mason climbed onto the opposite side and began helping. They worked together beneath the soft glow of work lights while the enormous room remained silent, except for quiet conversation drifting naturally between them. Ryan smiled as he adjusted another light. "You know, you never have to volunteer this much." Mason looked down from the stage with an amused expression. "Maybe I like the company." Ryan laughed softly before returning to his work. "I was hoping that might be the reason." The simple exchange lingered in Mason's thoughts long after they finished. Later that night, they sat together in the front row of the empty auditorium, looking toward the stage where dozens of chairs waited for tomorrow's rehearsal. Mason rested his elbows on the seat in front of him while studying the quiet room. Do you ever wonder how different life could have been if one small moment had happened another way? Ryan turned toward him thoughtfully. "Every once in a while." Mason smiled faintly. "If you had never opened that rehearsal room door." Ryan gently shook his head before Mason could finish. "I probably would have met you anyway." Mason looked surprised. Ryan continued with quiet confidence. "People who care about music always seem to find each other eventually." The words settled warmly inside Mason, dissolving another piece of the fear he had carried for so long. After rehearsal the following afternoon, snow began falling more heavily than expected, covering the parking lot and nearby streets in fresh white. Rather than rushing home, Mason and Ryan walked slowly through the peaceful neighborhood, leaving a trail of footprints behind them. The world seemed unusually quiet as snow softened every familiar sound around them. They stopped beside a small community park where holiday lights shimmered across frozen tree branches. Mason looked toward Ryan, his voice almost lost beneath the gentle snowfall. "Can I tell you something I have never said out loud?" Ryan met his eyes with calm reassurance. "You never have to ask permission." Mason took a slow breath. "For years I believed that if people truly knew me, they would slowly walk away." Ryan remained silent, giving Mason all the time he needed. Mason smiled sadly before continuing. "Then you walked into that room on the one night I thought I had completely fallen apart." Ryan's expression softened. "I did not see someone falling apart," he answered quietly. "I saw someone carrying more than anyone should have to carry alone." Mason lowered his eyes for a brief moment before looking back with gratitude that words could barely express. Standing together beneath the softly falling snow, he realized the greatest change in his life had never come from being discovered. It had come from meeting someone who chose understanding over judgment, patience over assumptions, and kindness over every fear that had once convinced Mason he needed to face the world by himself. The night of the Winter Showcase finally arrived, filling the Performing Arts Center with families, teachers, and neighbors whose excited conversations echoed through every hallway. Snow continued falling outside, covering the sidewalks in a soft white blanket, while warm lights inside the building welcomed every guest through the front doors. Backstage, performers moved carefully between dressing rooms and rehearsal spaces, checking instruments one last time before the curtain rose. Mason stood alone behind the stage, quietly stretching his fingers as he prepared to perform an original piano composition for the first time in his life. Months earlier, the thought would have terrified him. Every note would have felt like another opportunity to disappoint someone. Tonight, the fear still existed, but it no longer controlled him. He reached into his jacket pocket and unfolded the small handwritten note Ryan had left beside the coffee so many weeks before. The paper had become worn from being carried everywhere, yet the words remained perfectly clear. "Take your time." Mason smiled before carefully folding it again. A gentle knock sounded against the dressing room door. Ryan stepped inside carrying 2 paper cups of hot chocolate. "I figured coffee might not be the best choice before a piano performance," he joked with an easy smile. Mason accepted one of the cups and laughed softly. "You always seem to know exactly what I need." Ryan leaned against the doorway, studying Mason with quiet pride. "Not exactly," he answered. "You have been discovering that yourself." The announcement for the opening performance echoed through the hallway, signaling that the audience had taken their seats. Mason drew a slow breath, feeling the familiar nervousness return for a brief moment. Ryan noticed immediately. He did not offer a speech or remind Mason to be confident. Instead, he simply said, "No matter how tonight goes, nothing about who you are depends on one performance." Those words settled every remaining doubt more effectively than applause ever could. Moments later, the stage lights dimmed, and Mason walked toward the grand piano waiting beneath a single spotlight. Hundreds of faces disappeared into darkness beyond the bright stage, leaving only the instrument before him. He placed his hands gently on the keys and closed his eyes for one quiet second. Then the music began. The melody carried traces of everything he had experienced during the past several months. There were gentle passages that reflected peaceful mornings, hopeful harmonies shaped by unexpected friendship, and moments of quiet uncertainty that slowly transformed into confidence without ever rushing the journey. Every note felt honest because it no longer tried to become someone else's idea of perfection. When the final chord faded into silence, the audience remained still for one breathtaking moment before rising together in warm applause that filled the auditorium. Mason stood slowly, overwhelmed not by the standing ovation itself, but by the realization that he had finally shared something completely true without hiding any part of himself. After greeting guests and thanking fellow performers, he slipped outside onto the front steps of the center, where fresh snow continued drifting beneath the streetlights. Ryan joined him a few minutes later, wrapping his scarf a little tighter against the cold evening air. Neither of them spoke immediately. They simply watched snowflakes settle across the quiet street. Mason finally broke the silence with a gentle smile. "I think tonight was the first time I played exactly as myself." Ryan looked at him with the same calm kindness that had been there from the very beginning. That is why everyone listened. Standing together beneath the softly falling snow, Mason understood that courage had never arrived all at once. It had grown through ordinary mornings, patient conversations, shared laughter, and one unexpected act of understanding that taught him the greatest performance of his life would never be the one on stage. It would be the choice to live honestly, one day at a time, beside someone who had quietly believed in him long before he believed in himself. The weeks following the winter showcase passed more quickly than Mason expected, carrying with them a quiet confidence that still felt unfamiliar each time he noticed it. Winter gradually loosened its grip on the city as patches of green returned beneath melting snow, and the Performing Arts Center filled once again with the hopeful energy of a new season. Mason continued teaching beginner piano workshops on Saturday mornings while composing music during quiet evenings after rehearsals. Ryan remained close by, encouraging young performers with the same patience that had first changed Mason's life, yet neither of them tried to define what their growing connection had become. Somehow the absence of pressure allowed everything meaningful to grow naturally. One Monday afternoon, the artistic director called Mason into her office with unexpected news. A prestigious conservatory in Boston had selected one of his original compositions for an advanced fellowship program beginning later that year. It was the opportunity he had dreamed about since he first touched a piano as a child. The fellowship promised professional mentorship, national performances, and the chance to build a career beyond anything he had imagined. Mason thanked her with genuine excitement. Yet as he stepped back into the hallway, another feeling quietly settled beside his happiness. Boston was nearly 1,000 miles away. That evening he folded the acceptance letter into his backpack, but found himself unable to mention it to anyone. Ryan immediately noticed something had changed. During their usual walk through the Riverside Park, Mason answered questions with short smiles and thoughtful silence. Finally, Ryan stopped beside a bench overlooking the water, where the first spring flowers had begun blooming beneath tall maple trees. "You have been carrying something all day," Ryan said gently. Mason hesitated before removing the envelope from his backpack and handing it over. Ryan read the letter carefully, then looked up with unmistakable pride. "This is incredible." Mason searched Ryan's face, almost expecting disappointment to appear somewhere beneath the smile. It never did. "It means moving away," Mason said quietly. Ryan folded the letter with care before returning it. "It means your music reached people who believe in it." Mason lowered his eyes. "I do not know if I am ready to leave." Ryan rested against the bench, watching sunlight shimmer across the river. "Maybe that is the wrong question." Mason looked over. Ryan smiled softly. "The better question is whether you will regret saying no because you are afraid." Those words lingered between them as a gentle breeze carried the scent of fresh blossoms across the park. Mason realized Ryan had never once asked him to stay. He had never tried to shape Mason's future around his own hopes. Every act of kindness, every quiet conversation, every moment of encouragement had always pointed in one direction only, toward the life Mason truly wanted to live. As the sun slowly disappeared behind the skyline, Mason understood that real care never asked another person to become smaller for its own comfort. It celebrated their growth, even when that growth led them somewhere unexpected. Walking home beside Ryan that evening, Mason realized the most difficult decision of his life was no longer choosing between fear and honesty. It was choosing between two futures that both mattered deeply, knowing that whichever path he followed would forever carry the quiet influence of the person who had first taught him that being truly seen was never something to fear. Mason carried the fellowship acceptance letter for several days before finally signing it. The decision brought excitement, but it also arrived with a quiet sadness that surprised him. Boston represented everything he had worked toward for years, yet every step closer to that dream also meant moving farther from the place where he had finally learned to stop hiding. Spring settled gently across the city as flowering trees surrounded the Performing Arts Center with fresh color, making every familiar path feel even more difficult to leave behind. Ryan never asked whether Mason had made his decision. He simply continued showing up exactly as he always had, helping students prepare for recitals, organizing community concerts, and greeting Mason each morning with the same easy smile that had slowly become part of his daily routine. One afternoon, after finishing a youth piano workshop, Mason found Ryan arranging chairs inside the empty recital hall. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, filling the room with soft golden light that reminded Mason of the evening everything had begun. He walked onto the stage without speaking and quietly sat beside the grand piano. Ryan noticed the thoughtful expression on Mason's face and joined him a moment later. For several minutes, they listened to the peaceful silence surrounding the empty auditorium. Mason finally reached into his backpack and placed the signed acceptance letter on top of the piano. Ryan read the first page, then looked back with genuine happiness shining in his eyes. "I knew you would choose this," he said warmly. Mason smiled, although his eyes revealed emotions that words still struggled to describe. "I almost did not." Ryan rested one hand gently against the polished piano. "Why?" Mason looked across the rows of empty seats before answering. "Because for the first time in my life, leaving somewhere actually feels difficult." Ryan nodded slowly, understanding far more than Mason had spoken aloud. He folded the letter carefully and returned it. "That only means you found something worth remembering here." Mason drew a slow breath. "I was afraid you would ask me to stay." Ryan shook his head with quiet certainty. "If I truly care about you, I cannot ask you to walk away from your dream just to make me feel less lonely." The words settled into the silence between them like the final note of a beautiful melody. Mason felt every remaining uncertainty begin to disappear. He realized Ryan had never tried to hold on to him through guilt, promises, or impossible choices. Instead, he had spent months helping Mason become strong enough to choose freely. As evening approached, they walked together through the nearby park where fresh blossoms drifted gently across the pathways. Children laughed beside the fountain while musicians performed acoustic songs beneath blooming cherry trees. Everything around them seemed filled with quiet beginnings. Mason stopped beside the small pedestrian bridge where they had shared so many conversations over the past months. Looking toward the calm river below, he spoke with complete honesty. "When you first opened that rehearsal room door, I thought my life was falling apart." Ryan smiled gently. "And now?" Mason turned toward him, no longer carrying the fear that had once followed him everywhere. "Now I think it was the first moment my real life finally began." Ryan did not rush to answer. He simply stood beside Mason as the evening light reflected across the water, knowing that sometimes the greatest act of love was not convincing someone to stay, but giving them the confidence to leave while believing they would always find their way back to the people who truly understood them. 1 year later, the familiar brick walls of the Lincoln Ridge Performing Arts Center stood beneath the warm glow of an early autumn sunset, welcoming students through the same front entrance where Mason Walker had once walked in, carrying more fear than hope. The trees lining the courtyard had turned shades of gold once again, and the quiet breeze carried the unmistakable sound of distant piano scales drifting through open rehearsal room windows. Mason paused on the front steps with a small travel bag resting over one shoulder, taking in every familiar detail as though he were seeing the building for the first time. Boston had given him everything he once dreamed about. His fellowship had challenged him. His music had grown stronger, and audiences across the country had begun recognizing his original compositions. Yet the greatest lesson had never come from concert halls or master classes. It had come from learning that success meant very little if he could not share it honestly with the people who had believed in him before anyone else did. Inside the lobby, volunteers prepared for another community concert while young musicians hurried toward evening rehearsals with nervous excitement. The building looked almost exactly as it had on the night everything changed, except this time, Mason walked through its halls without lowering his eyes or questioning whether he belonged. He smiled naturally at familiar teachers, greeted old friends with genuine confidence, and quietly thanked the receptionist who happily welcomed him home. As he reached the recital hall, he noticed someone standing alone near the front row, carefully arranging concert programs before guests began arriving. Ryan Carter looked up almost at the same moment. For a brief second, neither of them moved. Then the easy smile Mason remembered so clearly returned exactly as it always had. Ryan crossed the aisle at an unhurried pace, stopping only a few feet away. "Welcome home," he said softly. Mason laughed, feeling every mile between Boston and home quietly disappear. "It feels good to hear that." Ryan studied him with quiet pride. "You look different." Mason nodded with a grateful smile. "I finally feel like myself." They walked together through the empty auditorium while the last rays of sunlight stretched across the polished wooden stage. Mason reached into his backpack and removed a carefully bound collection of original piano compositions. He handed it to Ryan without saying anything. Inside the front cover, written in neat handwriting, appeared a simple dedication. "For the person who taught me that being seen was never something to fear." Ryan looked up slowly, visibly moved by the words before closing the book with gentle care. "I did not teach you that," he said. "You discovered it yourself." Mason shook his head with quiet certainty. "Maybe, but you stayed long enough for me to believe it." The house lights gradually dimmed as audience members began filling the auditorium. Before taking their seats, Mason glanced toward the familiar rehearsal hallway where one ordinary evening had unexpectedly changed the direction of his entire life. He smiled, remembering the frightened young man who had rushed past an open door, believing he had been seen at his weakest. Looking back now, he understood that he had not been caught at all. He had been found. Found by someone who never demanded explanations, never offered judgment, and never asked him to become anyone other than himself. As the opening notes of the evening concert filled the room, Mason and Ryan sat side by side, no longer connected by uncertainty or fear, but by quiet trust patiently built through kindness, honesty, and countless ordinary moments that had become extraordinary simply because they chose to face them together. Sometimes the greatest love story does not begin with perfect timing or dramatic promises. Sometimes it begins when one person opens the wrong door at exactly the right moment, and instead of turning away, chooses to stay.